A flight attendant tried to humiliate a black CEO mid-flight, but what happened next turned the entire cabin silent. A flight attendant broke a black CEO's hand mid-flight. Thinking the pain would silence him, he didn't realize the next minute would flip the entire cabin upside down. The moment that bone snapped, the balance of power shifted. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true strength rises. The overhead cabin lights flickered just once, just long enough to feel wrong. Dr. Renlor Vance looked up. He was halfway down the first-class aisle of AerionSky Flight 772, his polished shoes whispering against the carpet, his left wrist carrying the weight of a locked capsule, matte black, tamper-sealed, and unmistakably important. The flicker wasn't dramatic. Most passengers didn't notice. But Renlor, trained in both human nuance and system anomaly detection, caught it like a whisper behind a closed door. It was the kind of brief voltage stutter that wouldn't trip a warning in an engineer's log, but would mean something to a strategist. Still, he said nothing. A simple glance, a longer blink, and he continued walking. Seat 2A. He reached it, nodded politely at the passenger already seated in 2B, then met the eyes of the tall flight attendant standing 2 rows ahead. The man's build was squared, rigid, a jaw like carved limestone, and his pressed uniform sleeves creased too perfectly to have seen labor. His name tag read, Tarren Holt. "Welcome aboard," the man said. The words were correct, but they didn't carry welcome. His tone was neutral, clipped, and sterile, like reading a warning off a control panel. Renlor gave a slight nod and replied with a quiet, "Thank you," sliding into 2A. His charcoal gray suit barely wrinkled as he sat, placing his briefcase carefully beneath the seat ahead. Every movement was measured. Precision was Renlor's comfort zone, yet he felt it again. Tarren's gaze dipped, not to his face, not to his boarding pass, but directly to the capsule affixed to his wrist. Not lingering like curiosity, not casual like habit, but verifying, like a man confirming a target. Renlor instinctively adjusted his sleeve, covering the capsule, though not in fear, just awareness. Outside the sealed windows, the final rays of the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks over the tarmac. The jetway pulled back slowly. A slight jolt ran through the cabin as the plane prepped for pushback. But inside, a different kind of system was already in motion. Tarren moved down the aisle briskly, checking seat buckles and compartments, but never once glancing at his manifest. His pattern wasn't customer service. It was pre-programmed movement. Renlor's eyes tracked him briefly, then shifted to the passenger safety card. But he wasn't reading it. He was thinking. The capsule on his wrist contained the only live prototype of Nexaron Analytics Helix Gate Firewall, a national defense algorithm designed to shield digital infrastructure at quantum speed. The capsule could not be cloned, could not be wirelessly accessed, and could only be opened with Renlor's dual-hand biometric sequence, verified live. It was not just valuable, it was irreplaceable, and it was supposed to be invisible. Only 4 people outside the Continental Cyber Council even knew he was traveling with it. Or so he thought. As the plane taxied, Renlor reclined slightly, his breath even, his presence calm. But inside, the calculations had begun. Something about Tarren Holt didn't align with the expected variables of a commercial flight. The man's posture, his too sharp gaze, his failed attempt at small talk, it wasn't the behavior of someone doing their job. It was the behavior of someone on assignment. Renlor glanced once toward the galley. Tarren was already there, facing away, but checking his tablet. He wasn't reviewing food logs. He wasn't arranging service. And he wasn't alone in knowing. Renlor's thoughts flicked to a name, Varikulum, CEO of Silvatech Dynamics, a man who had once referred to Helix Gate as a hostile overwrite of the current empire. Loom had motive. He had reach. And he had made threats before, not with words, but with actions cloaked in plausible deniability. Renlor dismissed the thought for now. Assumptions didn't serve him without proof. The cabin doors sealed. The engines began to hum, low and powerful. Tarren walked past his seat one more time. He didn't make eye contact this time. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. Renlor adjusted his wrist slightly, covering the capsule more securely. Outside, the plane lifted into a pale orange sky, engines slicing through air with mechanical calm. Inside, the players were now locked together, sealed in metal, 30,000 feet above consequence. Renlor exhaled once, long and slow, letting his mind move to the meeting tomorrow. He'd still make it. He had to. But the flicker of those lights returned in memory. So did the stare. He didn't know it yet, but Tarren Holt wasn't part of the crew because he worked for AerionSky. He was here because someone else wanted the capsule extracted, and they didn't want Renlor alive when it happened. Sometimes danger waits quietly in the aisle beside you. Tarren Holt slammed an overhead bin with more force than necessary, the sharp metallic clang cutting through the quiet murmur of boarding passengers settling into their seats. The compartment hadn't been overfilled. It had merely annoyed him, or rather, something deeper had. His lips pressed into a flat line as he moved past row 2. Dr. Renlor Vance, seated in 2, looked up from his tablet and tracked the attendant's rigid movements with quiet calculation. The flight hadn't even left the ground, but something already felt misaligned. Not wrong enough to act, but wrong enough to notice. Tarren's steps were mechanical, too exact for routine. His shoulders squared unnaturally each time he neared the cockpit, his eyes darting toward the forward door more than toward any of the passengers. A practice routine, maybe, or distraction. Renlor's instincts sharpened, not from paranoia, but from pattern. He'd spent his life detecting threats that hid inside systems. And this wasn't code. This was a person. Still, he didn't react. Renlor adjusted his lapel, flicked through a few more files on the Helix Gate interface, and glanced at the capsule still locked to his right wrist. Its matte shell gleamed faintly beneath the reading light, harmless to the untrained eye, but to anyone in the data security world, it might as well have been a crown jewel. Contained within was a prototype that could restructure the digital backbone of the nation. He'd expected resistance, legal challenges, intellectual theft, even court injunctions. But not this. Not the feeling of unease in a pressurized cabin, 45 minutes before takeoff. Then it happened. Tarren stopped beside his seat. Not like a flight attendant checking rows, more like a man confirming a target. "If you need anything, just call," Tarren said, the words sliding out in a tone that lacked all service. There was no hospitality in his voice, only a quiet threat hidden beneath the syllables. Renlor's eyes met his steady. "Thank you," he said evenly, but he noticed Tarren's gaze drop, not to his face, but to his wrist. The capsule. A beat too long. A flicker too direct. And then Tarren moved on, leaving only his shadow and an uneasy quiet in his wake. Across the aisle, another figure hovered subtly, tall, younger, lighter in movement. Kiri's Dorn. His hands moved efficiently as he rearranged the stack of unused blankets, but his attention wasn't on the task. It was on Tarren. Kiri's expression tightened whenever the senior attendant passed, his jaw flexing like he was biting backwards. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. He didn't understand what was happening yet, but he understood that something wasn't right. Renlor noticed him, too. Kiri's eyes met his just for a second, then dropped, then returned. No words, just an acknowledgement between men who could sense a fracture in the cabin before the break occurred. A soft chime overhead. The cabin door sealed. Engines murmured to life beneath the fuselage. The plane began to taxi. Renlor placed his tablet down, slid his hand slightly over the capsule as if checking the strap, not to secure it, but to reassure himself it was still his. Still connected. Still intact. As the aircraft lifted into the night, the city lights of Vernell faded beneath them, swallowed by cloud and altitude. In the dimming cabin, passengers leaned back, adjusted headphones flipped through magazines. But in seat 2A DR, Renlor Vance remained upright, eyes open, posture alert, not from discomfort but discipline. He was a man easily rattled, but he knew systems. And this system, the human one inside this aircraft, was misbehaving. He thought of Varric Loom, the CEO of Silvatech Dynamics, a competitor turned nemesis. Months earlier, Loom had mocked Helix Gate as too clean to be real. Weeks later, his tone changed. Silence, followed by inquiry, followed by patent disputes. And now, perhaps something far less visible. Renlor hadn't considered Loom would stoop to sabotage. That miscalculation now vibrated through the cabin air like unspoken static. Tarren reappeared after takeoff, this time walking the aisle slower, pausing often, glancing down rows not for passenger comfort, but for confirmation. He passed row 2 again, briefly stopping. No reason. No announcement. Renlor raised an eyebrow. Tarren smiled faintly and said, "Smooth takeoff." Renlor responded with a neutral nod. "Indeed." And then the attendant leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping a fraction. "Let us know if you feel unwell." The words landed softly, but carried an edge. Renlor turned fully in his seat. "Excuse me." But Tarren was already moving, his back to him, shoulders stiff once again. Not threat. Not yet. But not right. Kyrie's watched the exchange. He was now at the front galley, hands gripping the edge of the coffee drawer as though grounding himself. He whispered something into a small communicator clipped beneath his vest, then glanced back toward row 2A. Renlor settled again, but this time, he wasn't reading. His mind shifted from protocol to survival. He scanned the aisle layout, memorized crew movements, clocked distances between exits and carts. The man in 3B had fallen asleep. The man in 1A was watching a documentary. No one noticed the scene that had just passed. But Renlor had, and so had Kyrie's. And though neither of them could predict what form the threat would take, they both felt its shape pressing closer with every mile. The skies outside were calm. Inside, the air was tightening. Renlor closed his eyes briefly, rehearsing something silently in his mind. He was no longer flying to Orinth to present an algorithm. He was flying through a test he hadn't expected to take. Calm skies hide sharp intentions. The impact came fast and clean. The metal tray, polished to a muted sheen, slammed downward in a deliberate arc, catching Dr. Renlor Vance's right hand as it reached for the glass of water. The edge of the tray met bone with cruel precision, crushing his hand between cold metal and the armrest. A crack, sharp, wet, unmistakable, echoed through the cabin louder than the clatter of the cup as it tumbled to the floor. Renlor's breath seized. His head jerked forward, and for a brief moment, he couldn't hear the ambient noise of the aircraft, only the pulsing throb that erupted from his hand and climbed up his forearm like wildfire. Pain blistered through the nerves, and a sound escaped his throat, not a scream, but a stifled gasp that twisted his lips into a grimace. Gasps came from a few passengers nearby, startled more by the sound than the sight. The glass rolled to a stop under seat 2C. Silence stretched. Then came Tarren Holt's voice, loud and clipped. "Sir, keep your hands to yourself." He straightened theatrically, holding the now empty tray like a prop in a performance, his tone rehearsed, his volume perfectly calibrated to cast doubt. Passengers looked on, confused, unsure of what they'd just seen. From the outside, it looked like Renlor might have reached too quickly, maybe startled the attendant. Maybe it really was an accident. But Renlor knew better. His eyes, wide with pain, locked onto Tarren's face. And in that moment, beneath the veil of faux professionalism, he saw it. Not guilt, not concern, but calculation. Tarren's jaw was tight, his eyes unflinching, and his hands never trembled. This wasn't carelessness. It was controlled, practiced. His hand was broken. Renlor didn't need an x-ray to know. He could feel the instability beneath the swelling, the unnatural twist of his fingers, the heat surging under the skin. And more than the pain, what filled him was understanding. This was no accident. This was initiation. Tarren turned and walked away briskly. The tray held just slightly higher now, as if needing to avoid contact with any other dangerous passenger. As he passed the curtain to the galley, Renlor saw him glance once, quick, precise, at his wrist. Not at Renlor, at the capsule locked there. The pain sharpened Renlor's focus. His mind, trained by years of navigating corporate sabotage, began mapping out the implications. The capsule required biometric confirmation from his right hand to unlock. And now that hand was mangled. Not an accident, a premeditated strategy. He cradled the injured limb, trying not to let the trembling spread up his spine. The cold air from the vent above stung his temples, sweat already gathering despite the cabin's chill. He looked at the other passengers. Most had gone back to their books or screens, lulled into normalcy by routine flight behavior. A few still glanced over, uncertain, but none had seen clearly enough to intervene. That was part of the plan, wasn't it? To make it seem like a mishap, to isolate him, to discredit him subtly, just enough to allow further escalation under the guise of protocol. A soft voice broke the swirl of analysis. That didn't look like an accident. Kiri's Dorn stood just behind the service curtain, his posture bent as if checking the overhead bin. His face, young and uncertain, barely turned toward Renlor. The words were low, barely audible. Renlor looked up at him. Their eyes met for only a second, but it was enough to register the tremor in Kiri's expression. The young attendant wasn't in on it, but he wasn't ready to defy protocol either. Kiri's hesitated, then moved along the aisle, continuing his task. Renlor exhaled slowly. His pulse thundered in his ears. Beneath the pain, his thoughts moved like data flowing through encrypted channels. Tarren's objective was clearer now. Disable the capsule. Prevent Renlor from authenticating it. Possibly take it outright before landing. But that raised deeper questions. Who gave him those orders? Who knew which flight Renlor would be on? Only a handful of Nexaran staff had access to his itinerary, and all had been vetted under federal clearance, which meant someone outside the company had found a way in. That narrowed it down. Silvatech Dynamics. Varric. The name formed like a bitter taste in Renlor's mouth. Loom had everything to lose if Helix Gate passed certification, and everything to gain if it disappeared en route. Renlor's fingers twitched reflexively, drawing another bolt of agony. He forced himself to breathe evenly. The algorithm was still secure, he reminded himself. The capsule's internal sensors hadn't triggered any tamper alerts yet, but he had to act. Quietly, strategically. He reached across his lap, using his working left hand, and began to unclip the capsule's mount. Every movement sent jolts of pain up his spine, but he moved slowly, carefully, like defusing an old mine. With effort, he detached the lock ring and began transferring the capsule to his left wrist. The buckle clicked into place. Tarren hadn't seen it. Not yet. But when he did, things would escalate. Renlor sat back in his seat, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt. His face remained calm, unreadable, but inside, everything shifted. He had lost the use of his dominant hand, but not his mind, and not the plan. Kiri's passed by again. This time, his eyes flicked down to the switch capsule and then quickly away. He didn't pause, didn't speak, but the message was clear. He saw it. Renlor took a long, measured breath and stared straight ahead as the cabin lights dimmed slightly for cruising altitude. He knew what was coming next. Tarren would test again. Harder. The man wouldn't stop until the objective was complete or until he was stopped. From here on, every decision would matter. Every second would count. The injury wasn't the end. It was just a trigger, because now the game had begun. A broken bone can reveal a hidden plan. The announcement came just as Renlor shifted the capsule from his injured right wrist to his left. For your safety, we're anticipating mild turbulence ahead. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, but something in the tone felt staged. The cabin didn't lurch, the lights didn't flicker, and the air remained perfectly smooth. Renlor's eyes narrowed. Turbulence was the kind of pretext a crew could use to justify unusual passenger movement, forced relocations, or aggressive restraint, all under the guise of protocol. And as if summoned by that suspicion, Tarren Holt reappeared at the edge of the aisle like a storm cloud in uniform. "You'll need to relocate to the back," he said without preamble, voice sharp, eyes unreadable. Renlor didn't flinch. "This seat is assigned by biometric clearance. I'm not authorized to move." Tarren's eyes darkened. He didn't reply. Instead, he slowly locked the first-class lavatory door behind him with a flick of his elbow. The soft click barely registered under the hum of the engines, but it marked a boundary, a zone no longer shared with the rest of the cabin. Then he stepped sideways into the aisle, blocking the sight line between Renlor and the rest of the passengers. The curtain separating first class from main was already drawn. Renlor felt his pulse elevate, but his posture remained calm. He adjusted his tie, his breath measured despite the pain searing through his right hand. The shift of the capsule to his left wrist had clearly unsettled Tarren. That alone told him something. The plan hinged on disabling the capsule, not just him. From the other side of the cabin, Kiri's Dorn passed by, seemingly checking overhead bins. But when he reached Renlor's row, he leaned in, as if adjusting the reading light. "Something's wrong with him," Kiri's whispered, barely audible. "I've seen him tense before flights. This isn't normal." Then he was gone. The comment lingered like fog in Renlor's mind. It was confirmation, not warning. Kiri's had seen something. Tarren wasn't simply rude or overzealous. He was calculated, and someone was watching. Kiri's might not act, but he had noticed. Tarren leaned closer. His shadow fell across Renlor's lap, and his voice was low, edged with something colder than authority. "You've had an accident. We can help if you cooperate." Renlor tilted his head. "I haven't requested assistance. You're visibly injured. It's protocol to assess your condition privately," Tarren replied. But his hand was already gripping the headrest of the adjacent seat, as though ready to push. The air felt thinner. Renlor's brain calculated variables: distance to the cockpit, number of rows to the emergency exits, location of the beverage cart, now wedged diagonally in the front aisle like a blockade. He could hear the faint clink of cutlery behind the curtain. A flight attendant in the galley? Or a cover noise for something worse? Tarren didn't move, not yet. But the space between them now felt like a trap about to spring. Renlor took slow, careful inventory. The capsule on his left wrist was still intact. His right hand was inflamed and beginning to swell, but he could flex 2 fingers. Enough. His voice remained composed. "If this is truly protocol, I suggest your supervisor join us. Otherwise, you're acting outside procedure." Tarren didn't respond. He just stared at Renlor's wrist again, his left one this time, his lip twitching like a silent curse had been bitten back. The implication was unmistakable. They thought they had neutralized him. They thought breaking his right hand had been enough to prevent access to the capsule. They didn't know about the firmware upgrade, the dual-input biometric mode he had tested just days before boarding. A miscalculation. The kind of mistake that meant whoever had paid Tarren for this job wasn't working with current intel. Still, the setup was working. Passengers couldn't see what was happening. The aisle was blocked, the curtain closed, the turbulence announcement already planted. And Tarren? He was still watching, still waiting, as if for a cue only he could hear. Renlor's instinct screamed to move, but not recklessly. Not yet. He glanced toward the emergency button embedded beneath the armrest. Pressing it would draw attention, but the timing had to be perfect. Too soon, and Tarren could twist the narrative. Too late, and the opportunity would vanish. A soft overhead ding broke the moment. Cabin lighting dimmed fractionally, a programmed signal that passengers might interpret as mood lighting for the meal service. But Renlor saw it differently. The stage was lit, the actors in place, and the next act had been silently cued. Tarren straightened. "I'll give you one more chance," he said. "Move. Now." Renlor didn't blink. His voice was cold and surgical. "No silence stretched." Tarren's eyes narrowed into slits, the calm mask cracking for just a second. Then he stepped back, not retreating, but positioning. His boot angled sideways, and his fingers curled slightly. The movement was precise. Practiced. Something was about to happen that no one else would fully witness. Renlor knew the trap had fully closed, but so had his awareness. The pain would come, but so would the response. Every breath, every muscle, every choice from here would either protect the mission or let it die midair. And so he waited. He watched. He prepared. Every calm moment is just the breath before the strike. Tarren struck without a word. His hand lunged down with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed the move in his mind a dozen times. No turbulence, no warning, just sudden pressure, sharp and violent, as his grip clamped hard around Renlor's right wrist, the one with the broken bones. A cry tore from Renlor's throat, involuntary, primal. His vision blurred as the white-hot agony screamed through his nerves. But it wasn't just pain, it was personal. Tarren twisted the wrist, and there was a sickening pop, louder than anyone expected, louder than decorum could ignore. A gasp echoed from a few rows back. A tray rattled. A baby whimpered. Tarren didn't flinch. "Sir, you've assaulted crew. We have protocol," he shouted, his voice rising in volume and performance alike. His tone was rigid, full of mock indignation, carrying over the quiet cabin like an official decree. He pulled back, as if to suggest Renlor had lashed out, putting on the show for the curious eyes now peeking between first-class seats. The illusion was calculated. The optics were weaponized. Renlor, chest-heaving, sank slightly into the seat, pain blurring the edge of his composure. But even as a shattered wrist screamed with every breath, his mind was mapping. He noted the position of the beverage cart, now blocking the forward galley, a bottleneck. He scanned seat placements to his left, counted 2 empty ones that might offer cover. His left hand, still unbroken, hovered near his lap, tensed but steady. He said nothing to Tarren. Not yet. From the galley, Kiri's Dorn's face appeared, half-shadowed. His jaw was tight, his eyes not just wide but trembling with silent rage. He wasn't just watching. He was recording. Kiri's reached up and pressed the toggle on his earpiece, a discreet confirmation that cabin dispute verification mode was active. Silent footage began rolling from the ceiling camera above the aisle. It would capture every second, every word, every gesture. Tarren didn't know. Yet, Tarren leaned in again, lowering his voice, but not the venom. "You think this ends with pain?" he hissed, brushing his fingers near the capsule, but missing it. His grip had gone for the right wrist out of habit or haste, not realizing the capsule had been moved. He thought he had struck the right target. He hadn't. Renlor's eyes met his, sharp through the pain. "Mistake," he whispered, voice low and deliberate, like the click of a safety being switched off. But Tarren wasn't done performing. He turned his head, addressing the passengers again. "For safety, this gentleman will be temporarily relocated. He's unwell." He reached to haul Renlor upward by his coat collar, making it look like assistance, though his fingers dug deep into bone. Renlor's shoulder wrenched. His broken hand dangled uselessly, swollen and bloodless. But his expression remained calm, deliberately calm. He knew that every movement now would be dissected in hindsight. Every gesture mattered. Every breath was strategy. He would not give Tarren the narrative he craved. As Tarren began dragging him toward the galley, Kiri's turned sharply and moved. He grabbed the emergency medikit from a side compartment, not to treat a wound, but to signal he had seen enough. His hand trembled slightly as he opened the lid, revealing not bandages, but a sleek black stabilization glove nestled beneath. Kiri's palmed it and closed the kit without a word. Tarren shoved Renlor back into the seat once more, theatrically brushing imaginary lint off his uniform, performing control for anyone still watching. He hadn't noticed the recording. He hadn't noticed the capsule switch. He hadn't noticed the look in Kiri's eyes. But Renlor had noticed everything. The pressure on his body was real. The pain was searing. The blood was cold in his fingertips. But none of that mattered, not in the face of strategy. This wasn't about surviving a fight. It was about preserving something far more valuable than his bones. Renlor sat straighter, despite the broken wrist, despite the threat, despite the false accusations beginning to spread through whispers down the aisle. He took in a breath. Slow, focused, controlled. Then, without looking at Tarren, he repeated the word again. This time quieter, not for drama, for clarity. Mistake. A man who breaks another's hand must be certain it's not the hand holding the plan. Tarren shoved Renlor hard against the galley service panel, the metal edge biting into his back. The impact jarred the broken bones in his hand, and a bolt of pain surged up his arm, but Renlor didn't cry out. He met Tarren's eyes with steady silence, his chest rising and falling as he fought to regulate each breath. The small galley space hummed with overhead ventilation, fluorescent lights flickering slightly above, casting harsh shadows over the stainless steel surfaces and Renlor's sweat-slicked forehead. They were just feet from the first-class curtain, but utterly out of view, isolated in a pocket of forced civility turned battleground. "You won't make it that far," Tarren said, his breath foul with stale coffee, his voice low and mechanical. "They'll recover the capsule after the landing." Renlor didn't respond, not aloud. But a thread of thought hardened in his mind. "You still think it's on this hand?" Tarren's eyes flicked briefly to the capsule affixed to Renlor's right wrist, unaware that Renlor had already transferred it to his left hand after the first injury. That was the flaw in the plan. The capsule now accepted dual biometric inputs, a feature Tarren could not have known unless he had access to the latest encrypted specs. He didn't. He was acting on outdated information. That gap, small but fatal, was all Renlor needed. Tarren reached toward the capsule, his fingers ready to unclasp it. Renlor moved first. With a subtle shift of his waist, concealed by the narrow confines of the galley, he pressed the inside of his belt loop with 2 fingers from his left hand. A barely audible click responded beneath the fabric, followed by a pulsing warmth against his hip. The emergency beacon, silent, encrypted, and tethered to Nexarin's private satellite grid, had been activated. It was designed for scenarios just like this: executive-level asset threat, zero ground support, airborne lockdown. The signal bypassed onboard comms entirely. Somewhere above them in the data ether, Nexarin's emergency response algorithm was already triggering failsafes. Tarren didn't notice. "Cooperate, and I won't have to drag you out of here unconscious," he muttered, tapping the capsule with the back of his knuckle. "This thing's worth more than your spine." Behind them, the curtain between the galley and first class shifted slightly. Kiri's Dorn's silhouette passed in partial view, wheeling the emergency medikit toward a crew storage panel. His eyes briefly met Renlor's. The message was wordless, but delivered. Kiri's had seen enough on the cabin cam feed. He wasn't just watching anymore. In a narrow corridor behind the service drawers, Kiri's unlocked the medikit and retrieved the thermal ice pouch first, an action that appeared routine. But tucked beneath it, buried between 2 sterile gauze wraps, was the real objective: a black compression glove, Renlor's spare stabilization brace. Left there by Renlor weeks ago as part of his executive travel precautions, it was designed to secure a damaged limb and restore limited precision. Kiri slipped the glove into the front fold of his apron and returned the medikit to its place. His steps were steady, but his breath came fast. Back in the galley, Renlor was slumped slightly now, his injured hand hanging limp, his suit cuffs soaked in sweat. His eyes, however, burned with quiet fire. Tarren gripped the capsule harder, trying to gauge how to twist it off without triggering a visible alert. He leaned closer, blocking even the dim light above. "You were never meant to walk off this flight," he whispered. But in that same moment, Kiri stepped in, voice controlled. "Med check," he said quickly, crouching near the drink cart as if to examine a drawer. With practiced ease, he palmed the glove from his apron and slid it under the galley counter, nudging it toward Renlor's foot. Tarren barely looked up. "He's stable," he snapped. "Ow." Kiri's hesitated, his expression unreadable, then nodded and stepped back. Renlor saw it, the moment of silent defiance. He let the glove rest near his shoe until Tarren shifted again, adjusting his stance. With slow, painful control, Renlor dragged the toe of his left foot forward, pinning the glove beneath it. He waited for the right breath, the right moment. His ribs ached. His spine pressed hard against the service wall. But his mind remained clear. A quiet mantra played in his thoughts. Observe. Adapt. Deliver. Tarren's hand moved once more toward the clasp. Renlor didn't flinch. Instead, he let his gaze rise, meeting the flight attendant's eyes with a calm that sent a chill into the narrow air. "You think I designed this to be recovered?" Renlor asked, his voice hoarse but steady. Tarren sneered. "You designed it to fail under pressure." Renlor's fingers twitched toward the glove, now tucked against his ankle. "No," he murmured. "I designed it for moments like this." Tarren didn't understand. Not yet, but he would. Soon. Behind the curtain, the faint murmur of passengers returned. The illusion of a normal flight hummed on, juice trays, murmured complaints, seat belts buckling, the quiet rattle of the beverage cart. But here, In the galley's artificial silence, a new thread of the story was being woven. Renlor slipped the glove up with his foot and caught it with his left hand beneath the hem of his jacket. Tarren didn't see. Not yet. But Kyrie's, watching from the edge of the curtain, saw the transfer and nodded faintly. Then Renlor mouthed one word, barely visible, spoken not to Tarren, but to the camera behind Kyrie's shoulder. Time. The difference between defeat and defense is knowing when to activate the hidden layer. Tarren lunged for the capsule. His hand clamped tightly over the latch locked around Renlor's swollen wrist. He believed the man was too weakened to resist, too hurt to react. But Renlor was ready. In one sharp breath, he slid his trembling left hand into the stabilizer glove Kyrie's had discreetly tossed near his foot just moments ago. Pain seared through his joints, but his mind cut through it like a scalpel. With 3 precise taps, hidden nodes only he knew, Renlor activated the tamper protocol embedded deep within the Helix Gate capsule. A sharp mechanical click echoed in the narrow galley. Tarren's body tensed, as if someone had snapped a steel cord through his spine. The capsule lit up with a pulsing red ring. Then a quieter sound followed. A chirp, followed by a cool, automated voice that filled the corridor like a whispered verdict. Unauthorized access attempt. Tarren Holt, Flight 772. Tarren's eyes widened. His breathing shifted from calculated to panicked. He hadn't expected the capsule to fight back. He hadn't expected Renlor to fight back. "You arrogant," he growled, but before he could finish the threat, rage overtook reason. Tarren shoved Renlor backward into the galley door. The metal edge dug into Renlor's spine with a hollow thud. The pain nearly buckled his knees, but he didn't collapse. In that instant, time slowed. The cabin lights dimmed briefly with another flicker. From behind the galley curtain, the faint rustle of a beverage cart being pulled by an oblivious crew member echoed softly. The cabin beyond stirred in confused silence, unaware of the battle unfolding just behind the curtain. Renlor drew a breath so deep it trembled. Then, with every ounce of force left in his frame, he launched his head forward. The crack was immediate and brutal. His forehead collided with Tarren's face at full force, catching the man directly across the bridge of the nose. Bone gave way with a nauseating snap, and Tarren reeled backward, clutching his face as blood burst forward in thick streams. His back slammed against the edge of the galley's metal counter, and his legs folded beneath him as he dropped to the floor. For a moment, there was nothing but the heavy sound of Renlor's ragged breathing. Then came the chaos. The front curtain snapped open. Kyrie's Dorn appeared, wide-eyed and feigning alarm. "Sir? Sir, are you all right?" he called out, voice carrying just enough panic to match the scene, just enough calm to keep it from spiraling. Passengers from nearby rows began shifting in their seats, peering toward the galley. The muted overhead lights revealed glimpses of confusion. Half-formed questions hung in the air, never quite spoken. Renlor didn't respond right away. He stood still, shoulders heaving, eyes fixed on the crumpled man at his feet. His left hand shook, still encased in the stabilizer glove. The capsule remained locked, blinking in silent defiance from where it clung to his wrist. Tarren groaned, slurring something unintelligible. His blood stained the galley floor, seeping toward the panel base. His composure, his control was gone. Kyrie's knelt beside him, placing 2 fingers on Tarren's temple to check for consciousness. "He needs medical assistance," Kyrie's announced calmly, loud enough for a nearby crew member to hear. But Renlor knew that wasn't all Kyrie's was checking. He met the young attendant's eyes. In that wordless exchange, Kyrie's nodded slightly, acknowledging not just the injury, but the recording, the proof, the moment. A shift had occurred. Tarren, who had moved with confidence, manipulation, and aggression, was now nothing more than a bloodied liability waiting for arrest. And Renlor, injured, exhausted, but still composed, had turned the tide without raising his voice, without breaking protocol. The cabin remained tense, unsure whether what they'd heard was just turbulence or something else. Whispers passed from one row to another. The atmosphere had changed. Renlor turned slowly, pressing his back gently against the galley wall to stabilize himself. His hand throbbed like a drumbeat. His head ached from the impact, but his expression remained unreadable. Every decision had led to this moment, and every ounce of restraint had been worth it, because the one who breaks silently is often the one who breaks through. He looked down once more at the man who had tried to end his mission with force. And then, without a word, he exhaled. Pain delivered is sometimes a delayed package with perfect timing. The attendant smirked, certain his uniform and ego would shield him, unaware that every witness, every camera angle, and every ounce of the CEO's restraint was turning into a precise counterstrike. If you believe cruelty under authority always folds when strategy meets power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The moment Tarren Holt hit the galley floor, blood dripping from his nose and pooling beneath his cheek, the flight's delicate balance of silence shattered. Kiri's Dorn didn't hesitate. With one hand gripping the emergency phone near the service panel, he signaled to the cockpit, his voice even but urgent. Code S4. Crew incapacitation. Cabin incident. Medical and federal response advised upon landing. In the cockpit, Captain Merijoran looked up from his instrument panel, brows narrowing. S4, he repeated, glancing his co-pilot, First Officer Rennick Vale. That's physical compromise. From who? Before an answer could come, the encrypted cabin security feed flashed to life on the secondary monitor. Kiri's had routed the footage directly to the flight deck. In full clarity, the camera showed Tarren's previous confrontation with Dr. Renlor Vance, specifically the deliberate grab, the violent twist of Renlor's injured hand, and the brief moment Tarren tried to access the capsule on his wrist. Then the retaliatory headbutt. Then blood. Captain Joran's face stiffened. That's not turbulence protocol. That's a takedown. Within moments, he keyed in the command for a midair incident report, routing it to AerionSky's Central Operations and, more critically, the Orient Federal Aviation Authority's airspace gate. A silent flag pinged on the Council's cyber monitoring grid, biometric tampering alert. A detail buried in the metadata, coded and time-stamped by the capsule, was now moving faster than the flight itself. Back in the cabin, a tense quiet had settled. Passengers in first class were murmuring, unsure if what they'd witnessed had been a scuffle, a health emergency, or something more sinister. A few had seen the headbutt. Fewer had seen what led up to it. And not one of them had seen what the capsule was truly carrying. Renlor Vance sat back into his right hand stabilized by the discreet glove Kiri's had retrieved earlier. The pain hadn't lessened. Each throb sent a dull wave of heat up his arm, but his focus was unshaken. His breathing was controlled, jaw clenched not from rage but calculation. Every part of him was charting what needed to happen next. Kiri's crouched beside the unconscious Tarren, pretending to check for signs of concussion while subtly confirming the small voice-activated lock on the capsule was still blinking. It was still recording, still transmitting. He tapped the hidden relay button beneath the comms panel, activating a silent crew alert, category red. Security breach. Internal personnel. Renlor watched him work, noting the professionalism despite the rising panic in Kiri's eyes. The young attendant wasn't trained for this, not truly. But he was doing what mattered, preserving evidence. Preserving the truth. A few minutes later, Captain Joran's voice came over the intercom, calm but clipped. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been advised of minor turbulence ahead. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Cabin crew, secure your stations. It was a coded message, used during internal flight disruptions when direct announcements might cause unrest. But Renlor understood the real meaning. Stay still. We're preparing for federal reception. He leaned back, pressing his head against the seat. The capsule had completed a full sync log. The mismatch alerts, triggered when Tarren had tried to open it, were now embedded in its memory and had been time-stamped by the onboard security node. He dictated a voice report under his breath, routed into the capsule's secondary memory. Unauthorized biometric attempt. Crew identity, Tarren Holt. Passenger retaliation occurred at 14:42 local flight time. Full logs available upon landing. His tone remained steady, calm. Every word counted now. In the rear galley, Keary's had finished relaying a quick medical formality to the cockpit, using the official line. Crew member unconscious, potential head trauma, cause uncertain. He knew it wouldn't stick, but protocol required plausible deniability until federal agents took over. And they would. At 34,000 feet, the consequences of violence, especially violence involving biometric tech, triggered more than just standard procedure. They triggered escalation chains. As the plane began its final descent toward Orinthe International, an air marshal in plain clothes, previously silent in seat 9C, stood and calmly approached the flight deck. He showed his credentials to the captain and was briefed on the footage and the capsule data. He nodded once, made a brief call via encrypted radio, and said just 3 words into the mic, "Prepare the corridor." By the time the landing gear locked into position, a corridor of waiting law enforcement agents had already lined the jet bridge at Gate 14C. Among them were 2 cyber assault specialists from the Continental Cyber Council, both carrying biometric validators and encryption scanners. Neither was smiling. The wheels screeched softly as they touched down. A quiet cheer rose from the back of the cabin. Just another flight completed for the average passenger. But in Seat 2A, Renlor remained motionless, his broken hand braced, his left hand gripping the capsule's inner clasp. First Officer Rennick opened the door only after confirming cabin lockdown was authorized. The lead federal agent stepped aboard as soon as the door opened, bypassing stunned flight attendants and moving directly toward Renlor's seat. His voice was measured. "Dr. Vance, you're safe. Please remain seated while we secure the suspect." At the front galley, Tarren, still groggy but conscious, was pulled to his feet by 2 officers. His arms were locked behind his back, wrists bound in reinforced cuffs. He offered no resistance now. The damage was done, but so was the upload. Passengers watched in confusion as Tarren was walked past them without explanation. One child whispered, "Was that a bad guy?" The father beside him didn't answer. Renlor didn't look at Tarren as he was escorted off. His eyes were on the agent beside him, who now held a verification scanner over the capsule. It blinked green, authentic, untampered, fully logged. "You did exactly what you were supposed to," the agent said quietly. "No," Renlor replied, his voice calm but firm. "I did what no one was prepared for." The plane emptied slowly after that, the debriefs just beginning for passengers unaware of how close they'd flown to catastrophe. But Renlor had already shifted focus. He wasn't thinking about the pain anymore. He was thinking about the hearing, the tribunal, the next assault that wouldn't come with warning. Because the landing is never the final step, only the first frame of evidence. The moment the wheels touched down at Orinthe International, the cabin lights remained dimmed, but the atmosphere inside the aircraft felt heavier than recycled air. Renlor Vance sat upright in Seat 2, his broken hand braced by the stabilization glove Keary's Dorn had slipped him, his body aching but his mind immovable. Outside his window, he caught a glimpse of 2 figures standing on the tarmac, federal marshals in dark, unmarked uniforms. The cabin crew hadn't made a landing announcement. They didn't need to. The silence itself was a signal. This wasn't a routine arrival. Within seconds, before seat belts were fully unlatched, the marshals boarded. One moved straight to the galley. The other approached Renlor, his voice low and respectful. "Dr. Vance, we've received the signal. Are you secure?" Renlor gave a subtle nod. For now, they moved swiftly. Tarren Holt, still dazed from the impact against the metal galley counter, was restrained with a precision that suggested the marshals had done this many times before. He didn't resist. His eyes were unfocused, a dried ribbon of blood still under his nose. He muttered something incoherent, but no one listened. One of the marshals whispered into his collar mic, and the plane's door finally opened to the still dark terminal. Passengers remained in their seats, murmuring questions, none of them fully grasping what had occurred just rows ahead of them. The aircraft was officially grounded. For 3 hours, no one left. Each passenger was interviewed individually in a makeshift investigation zone set up in the terminal's secondary customs wing. Most passengers simply shrugged, offering little more than confusion. They hadn't seen much. They hadn't heard enough. One man claimed Renlor had reacted violently, but when pressed, admitted he had only caught a glimpse from behind newspaper. But the truth didn't rely on memory. Kiri's Dorn stepped forward. His body still trembled faintly from the adrenaline rush, but his voice was clear. He offered not only the footage from the cabin camera, beginning with Tarren's stage tray accident, but something else, an archive internal chat thread he had quietly saved months ago. He handed the transcript to the federal liaison, who raised an eyebrow as he scanned it. The logs revealed more than discontent. Tarren had been part of a covert network operating within AerionSky, flight crew members secretly trafficking passenger biometric data to shadow buyers. The chats included encrypted references to facial scans, boarding gate keystrokes, and pattern recognition tags from first-class travelers. But what caught the investigators was a line from Tarren, dated weeks prior. Priority is the capsule. Target sits to a next week. Authorization already cleared through side channel. Renlor's hand, fractured with surgical malice, had never been the goal in isolation. The attack was precise. The objective wasn't the capsule, but the protocols stored within Helix Gate. Proprietary, defense-approved, and still unbreakable. Unless stolen mid-transit. Unless the bearer was eliminated. Word of the breach reached the Continental Cyber Council before Renlor ever left the terminal. A priority notice had already triggered through the encrypted distress signal he activated during the flight. By the time his legal team and operations officers arrived at the airport's executive conference room, the council had summoned emergency clearance. Renlor sat down with them, his hand wrapped, jaw tight, but his presence unwavering. A second capsule, identical in build, but internally deactivated, was placed before the council for verification. Using only his left hand, Renlor authenticated the interface. The green light flicker confirmed sync. The dual biometric safeguard, originally a prototype feature, had preserved the data. His voice was calm as he presented the full Helix Gate pitch. He spoke not as a victim, but as a man who had outwitted the system meant to destroy him. Not once did he mention Tarren by name. He didn't need to. Every member of the council had already been briefed on the in-flight assault, the attempted compromise, and the biometric sabotage. By hour's end, the council voted unanimously to fast-track the integration of Helix Gate into their infrastructure. Meanwhile, in another wing of the terminal, Tarren Holt was officially charged. Federal officers read him his rights under biometric integrity and transport interference statutes. He barely blinked. His hands, the same that crushed Renlor's, now shook in cuffs. Kiri's Dorn stood nearby as the arrest unfolded, his posture tight, unsure if stepping forward had signed away his career. But when a senior council member offered him a private word, everything changed. "You acted when others wouldn't," the man said. "We don't forget that." Hours later, Renlor's executive advisor handed Kiri's a sealed envelope. Inside, a whistleblower protection agreement, and an offer letter from Nexarin Analytics. Kiri's opened the document in stunned silence. The job title was clear: Transit Integrity Operations Deputy Director. Outside, dawn crept over Orntha's skyline. A cargo vehicle rolled onto the tarmac, bearing the official seal of the Cyber Council. Its contents: reinforced biometric capsules, serialized for deployment. Renlor watched from the glass hallway above, pain still burning in his hand, but his eyes sharp as ever. This wasn't about retaliation anymore. It was about transformation. The quiet resistance had worked, and as his team escorted him from the terminal, the words he'd told Kiri's echoed, not in defiance, but in quiet affirmation. When you protect your vision with silence, make sure your silence has witnesses. The footage surfaced on the third day. It didn't come from the airline, the crew union, or a passenger. It came from Dr. Renlor Vance himself. Without warning or preamble, Nexarin Analytics released a crisp, time-stamped, unedited clip from Flight 772's cabin camera feed. The video showed Renlor reaching out for a glass of water with his right hand, and the moment Tarren Holt slammed the tray down with calculated force, crushing his hand against the armrest. The audible crack, the sharp intake of breath, the composed yet chilling whisper from Renlor: "Mistake." Alongside the footage, Nexarin attached capsule interaction logs, a biometric injury, scan verifying the fracture, and a short public statement authored by Renlor. It contained no threats, no demands, no mention of AerionSky by name. Just a single question, posed with precision. What protections exist for data guardians in transit? The media reaction was immediate and volcanic. Within hours, the phrase in-flight biometric sabotage began trending globally. Cybersecurity analysts dissected every frame of the footage in slow motion. Ethics panels released emergency statements. Travel commentators, tech executives, civil rights advocates all reacted in real time. Morning shows opened with the image of Renlor's swollen wrist beside the locked capsule. Evening panels debated whether airlines had become new battlegrounds for digital warfare. Renlor, however, was nowhere to be seen. Reporters camped outside Nexarin's headquarters. Cameras rolled at every airport hoping for a statement. But each inquiry received the same reply from Nexarin's media relations team. Dr. Vance prefers actions that outlive sound bites. Inside Nexarin's glass-paneled situation room, Renlor sat with his hands still in a brace, watching the news feeds. Beside him, Kiri's Dorn reviewed new footage requests from regulators. The clip of Renlor's calm defiance, his whispered mistake, had already aired over a dozen times in 24 hours. Not as a moment of drama, but as a symbol of quiet strategy under pressure. It wasn't rage, Kiri said quietly, watching the loop. It was timing. Renlor didn't reply. He was thinking 2 steps ahead. Across 3 data terminals, private correspondence revealed Varric Loom, the elusive CEO of Silvatech Dynamics, had abruptly withdrawn from 3 public tech summits. While no official charges had been filed, unnamed federal sources leaked that Loom had been questioned by agents investigating foreign crypto transfers and unauthorized access attempts against biometric intellectual property. At the same time, AerionSky's internal damage control effort floundered. 10 crew members were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The airline issued a vague statement referring to compliance inconsistencies and crew restructuring reviews, but public trust wavered visibly. In corporate boardrooms across the sector, terms like capsule protection, dual biometric access, and in-flight digital compliance risk were no longer buzzwords. They were mandates. Investors flooded Nexarin with fresh capital. The company's valuation tripled in less than 48 hours. And still, Renlor gave no interviews. The real breakthrough came when Nexarin released a short case brief to regulatory bodies. Not an accusation, but an analysis outlining how proximity-based sabotage could bypass legal safeguards through the exploitation of turbulence protocols, crew authority optics, and latent gaps in biometric hardware security. The document ended with a quiet line. Threat vectors don't need chaos. They need quiet moments where everyone assumes you're safe. In a final, haunting ripple across media networks, the original footage aired once more, this time with one detail enhanced. The moment Tarren grabs Renlor's wrist, there's a flicker of recognition in Renlor's eyes. Pain, yes, but also calculation. The viewers now knew what he'd done next. They watched the setup unfold, and the retaliation that followed, with fresh understanding. It wasn't vengeance. It was record-keeping. As analysts debated protocol reforms, as travel agencies scrambled to update crew training manuals, and as airlines rushed to implement new biometric safeguards, one truth became inescapable. Renlor hadn't shouted. He hadn't fought with rage. He had simply pressed record. Reputation isn't built by shouting. It's confirmed by surveillance he didn't know was rolling. The hearing room was smaller than Renlor expected. No grand stage. No echo of authority. Just a long wood-grain table, 6 committee members seated in strict symmetry, and a single chair at the center, his. The fluorescent lights above hummed steadily, casting clinical clarity over everything. No place for illusions here. He entered without ceremony, arms still in a cast, the Helix Gate capsule in his other hand. Deactivated now, but still sleek, still weighted with significance. Its matte black casing reflected the world's silence before the storm. Renlor placed the capsule on the table before sitting. He didn't glance at the cameras positioned on either side of the room, one for official record, one for internal audit. He didn't need the optics. This wasn't about headlines. This was about truth laid bare, even if it was too late for the bone in his hand. Chairman Darnick Vale, a sharp-eyed former Air Tech auditor, cleared his throat. Dr. Vance, we appreciate your presence today. We're aware of your condition and willing to limit the duration of your statement. Renlor shook his head once. I'll speak as long as I'm allowed, he said, voice firm, low, and steady. There were no opening pleasantries. Renlor opened with the truth. We built Helix Gate to defend national data infrastructure from synthetic breaches, biometric hijacks, and false clearance overrides. But I learned something else mid-flight. The vulnerability isn't just in the system. It's in the people given unchecked access to proximity. He paused, eyes sweeping the table. Some leaned forward. Others took notes. They didn't try to hack the code. They tried to break the body that carried it. Silence. A still breath of recognition passed through the room. The attack wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was packaged inside a cabin interaction designed to look like a misunderstanding. But it was rehearsed, precision-based. They aimed for my dominant hand because the capsule required a biometric seal from it. They didn't want my signature. They wanted my silence. The committee shifted. Two aides exchanged glances. The capsule, now inert, seemed to grow heavier on the table between them. I updated the capsule weeks before. Dual-auth biometric confirmation. Left and right. That small shift in architecture saved both the data and my life. They didn't know that. They thought I was one fingerprint away from irrelevance. Chairman Vale leaned in, eyebrows tightening. You're saying the sabotage was targeted, that this wasn't a rogue act of aggression. Renlor didn't blink. It was a test. If they could break me and still retrieve the capsule, the method would scale. Who's they? I'll leave that to the investigation logs, Renlor answered. But the pathway existed because the cabin's access protocols were outdated. Because flight staff weren't flagged for background breaches. Because there's no automatic cabin beacon for tampering with encrypted cargo in transit. That's not a policy oversight. That's a structural failure. A pause. Vale scribbled notes, then glanced at the others. But Renlor wasn't finished. My hand isn't the story, he said. It's what the hand represented. Decision-making, continuity, consent. When they fractured it, they tried to sever all three. But I want you to understand something deeper. The next attempt might not be on a hand. It might be on a heartbeat. The room froze. One of the committee aides dropped his pen. The words echoed, slowly, steadily, like a line that didn't just land but settled. Renlor didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The gravity was already moving through the air like a silent current. Everyone in the room could feel the truth behind it. Chairman Vale nodded once. We've heard enough. He turned to his staff. Bring forward the amendment drafts. Within 20 minutes, the federal committee passed a preliminary emergency compliance act. 3 mandates, locked and read aloud. All encrypted biometric capsules in transit must include dual-auth configurations. Cabin crew access logs must become tamper-proof and permanently archived. Automated beacon channels for encrypted cargo interference must be installed across all registered commercial aircraft. Unofficially, the reforms were already being called the Vance Protocols. But as the press asked Renlor for a name at the exit, cameras flashing, recorders shoved forward, he paused only a moment before answering. I don't call them that. I call them overdue. And then he walked past the crowd, leaving only the capsule behind on the committee table. Some reforms are born from strategy, but others from the sound of bone cracking in silence. Tarren Holt's voice cracked slightly as he delivered his final line. I thought he'd scream. I thought it'd be easy. He sat stiffly at the defense table in courtroom 42B, his hands cuffed, his jaw still faintly bruised from the galley retaliation that had silenced him midair. Across the aisle, Dr. Renlor Vance didn't blink. He simply exhaled through his nose, the cast on his right arm a quiet monument to what had been broken and what had not. Judge Marindor adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, voice calm but definitive. That miscalculation, he said, eyes narrowing at Tarren. demonstrates a lack of insight far more dangerous than your actions. Sentence: 12 years, federal custody. No parole. The gavel fell. Outside the courthouse, camera flashes lit the steps, but Renlor didn't pause. He exited through a side corridor, flanked by his legal counsel, ignoring the murmurs and click of shuttered interest. He had no appetite for press. The fight had already moved somewhere more important. At Nexeron's headquarters, the atmosphere was different, quieter, yet tense with focus. Gone were the buzz of celebration or corporate vanity. Inside the boardroom, a large monitor displayed the schematic for Capsule Guard, a civilian-grade biometric safeguard system, now expanded to serve not only defense contractors, but also investigative journalists, field researchers, ethical hackers, and human rights whistleblowers. People like Renlor had once been working in silence, moving between borders, carrying truth without protection. He stood at the head of the table, cast replaced with a high-grade polymer brace, and addressed his team of engineers and policy strategists. "We're not just shielding data anymore," he said plainly. "We're shielding the people who carry it." The room was silent, not out of fear, but reverence. They had all seen the footage, not just the violence, but the restraint, the way Renlor had endured, and survived, and proven. Across the room, Kiri's Dorn leaned slightly forward in his chair. His face was thinner now, older, matured by consequence, but his voice remained steady. Transit Integrity Division reports initial Capsule Guard field tests were successful in all regions, he said. We've deployed 37 to investigative units in high-risk zones. No breach. Zero failure. Renlor nodded once. We scale up. We cut licensing costs for civilian partnerships. And you, he turned to Kiri's, you'll lead this division full-time. Kiri's blinked. Me? Renlor offered a rare, small smile. Because you recorded proof when others would have offered sympathy. That was all. No applause. Just a shift in gravity as the room accepted the change. Kiri's appointment wasn't ceremonial, it was tactical. Meanwhile, the legal team delivered their report. Tarren Holt had been indicted on 6 counts: aggravated assault, biometric sabotage, unlawful obstruction of proprietary technology, conspiracy to interfere with federal data in transit, impersonation of crew protocols, and psychological coercion aboard a secured flight. The crypto transfer, $140,000 in untraceable coin, was traced back to a shell intermediary tied loosely to a known private data brokerage ring. The name was never revealed. Renlor didn't need it. He already knew it wasn't personal. It was profit. But what struck the presiding judge wasn't the money, the method, or even the intent. It was the arrogance. Tarren's quiet belief that brutality would lead to submission, that breaking a man's hand would erase the mind behind it. Back at Nexeron, Renlor entered the clean room alone that evening, past security checkpoints, retinal scans, and dual-off locks. The original Helix Gate capsule, the one that had survived Flight 772, rested on a cradle, deactivated, its biometric system wiped. It was no longer functional, but Renlor had kept it for a reason. He placed his injured hand next to it and stared. He remembered the moment of impact, the tray, the snap, the way his breath had caught, then steadied. A soft voice behind him spoke. "Are you keeping it as evidence?" Renlor didn't turn. "As memory. Evidence already did its job." His counsel stepped closer. "Do you feel closure?" Renlor looked down at his hand, flexed the fingers. Stiff but alive. "He only broke my hand," he said quietly, "not my access." And beneath the hum of climate-controlled silence, the words lingered like circuitry in the dark. "Let them break your body, but never let them rewrite your access." 6 months later, the moment returned, not in violence, but in silence. A slide clicked onto the screen at the Capsule Guard rollout in Orenthal. No music, no spotlight, just one image. Renlor Vance's bruised wrist with the joint swollen, fractured, but still strapped to the capsule, the same one that had triggered the chain reaction that changed an industry. The photo hung on the screen without introduction, drawing every eye in the room toward it. Conference lights dimmed to a faint glow, casting soft reflections off the capsule's metal edges in the image. Beneath it, 6 words had been etched in pale silver across the bottom of the slide. If I had fought with rage, I'd have lost the algorithm. No applause followed, just stillness. A room full of experts, flight safety architects, and cybersecurity engineers stood frozen, not in admiration, but in recognition. The kind that comes when principle outweighs spectacle. Renlor didn't walk onto a stage. He didn't want one. Instead, he stepped forward from the side of the room, dressed in a dark jacket with no visible branding, his left wrist still bearing the faint outline of the stabilization glove. No cameras had been invited, only witnesses. "I didn't come here to inspire," he said quietly, his voice steady, the tone not of a man seeking admiration, but of one finalizing an upload. "I came here to confirm that resistance can be strategic, that sometimes it must be." He looked around. Men nodded, pilots, engineers, security consultants, all grounded by their own experiences with system failure. He continued, "We designed Helix Gate to resist external access. But what we didn't expect was the attack would target the body instead of the code. That someone would try to erase a system not by rewriting it, but by breaking the hand that carried it." A rustle moved through the back rows. Some took notes. Others simply watched him, aware that they were hearing not a keynote, but a live post-mortem of a survival protocol. "Capsule guard," he said, gesturing to the display beside him, "is not just a device. It's a declaration. For those who carry vital data, not in briefcases, but in their identity, in their clearance, in their physical access, we needed a failsafe that couldn't be disarmed with a wrist twist." His fingers paused above the display controls. He pulled up a biometric diagram showing dual-auth pathways, one triggered by backup thumbprint, the other by pressure nodes embedded beneath the wristband. Both synced only when verified under distress-coded pulses. "This was Kiri's idea," Renlor added, nodding toward a tall, reserved man standing off to the right, Kiri's Dorn, now Director of Transit Integrity Operations. "When someone is being silenced, sometimes the only proof is what their silence leaves behind." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. The phrase would be repeated in articles, in boardrooms, in flight security briefings across the world. Behind Renlor, the display shifted again. VX 772. The etch code had become more than an internal build number. It had been voluntarily inscribed by pilots onto ID badges. Some flight crew wore it on their lapel pins, an informal symbol of accountability. It wasn't just about Renlor anymore. It had become about every man who'd been monitored, questioned, ignored, until the proof arrived too late. "I didn't retaliate to win," Renlor said, quieter now, the pain beneath his words still sharp but never exposed. "I retaliated so the proof would survive longer than the pain, so the capsule would outlast the strike." Someone in the back stood, then another. The silence transformed, not into applause, but into something heavier, agreement. Conviction. After the rollout ended, Kiri's walked beside Renlor through the quiet corridor outside the hall. Neither spoke for a while. "You think it'll stick?" Kiri's asked at last. Renlor glanced at his wrist. "Only if we keep wearing it. Not the device, the responsibility." Kiri's nodded. "That code, VX 772, it's showing up everywhere." Even the simulator crew in Varanth started using it. Renlor stopped walking, the quiet of the hallway holding them for a beat. "It's not mine anymore. It never was. It belongs to the moment." Kiri's looked at him. "What moment?" "The one where we didn't break." Later that month, over 40,000 capsule guard units shipped to field agents, journalists, civilian whistleblowers, and scientific liaisons. Each one bore the VX 772 inscription. Some chose to hide it. Others wore it openly. At a small aviation academy in northern Yelena, the final exam included a simulation titled 772 Interference Protocol. Cadets were told only one thing before it began. This is not a rescue scenario. This is a survival test. And in that test, every cadet had to make the same choice Renlor had made. Not to lash out, but to outlast. The final page of the official Capsule Guard documentation bore one quote, left unedited since its approval. "Some fights are won not by striking first, but by proving you survived long enough to finish the upload." Seconds later, the CEO's controlled retaliation landed with unstoppable force. The cabin froze, the crew panicked, and the attacker's own actions became the evidence that ended his career instantly. If you believe real authority responds with precision, dignity, and decisive strength, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the moment accountability and power meet arrogance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, respect, and standing up for justice in every situation.